Hello and good day. For today, let's continue the discussion in nature and effect of obligations. Recall that there are four grounds for liability to pay damages, and they are fraud, negligence, delay, and contravention of the tenor of the obligation. I have already discussed the first two grounds for liability to pay damages, and they are fraud and negligence. In this video, I'm going to discuss the last two grounds for liability to pay damages, and they are delay and contravention of the tenor of the obligation. Let's start with delay. Delay is otherwise known as default or mora. Recall that fraud is otherwise known as deceit or dolo. Negligence is otherwise known as fault or culpa. Ang delay naman, tinatawag din ito na default or mora. What is the meaning of delay or default or mora? Delay or default or mora is the non-fulfillment of an obligation with respect to time. In other words, delay or default or mora is the failure to perform the obligation in due time. Ang tanong, kapag hindi ba na-perform ni debtor ang kanyang obligation in due time, delay na ba si debtor or hindi pa siya delay? That question will be answered later. Before that, let's study first the kinds of delay. There are three kinds of delay, and they are mora solvendi, mora accipiendi, and compensatio morae. Mora solvendi is the delay on the part of the debtor. In other words, this is the debtor's delay. Merong dalawang klase ng mora solvendi. Yung una ay mora solvendi ex re at yung pangalawa ay mora solvendi ex persona. Mora solvendi ex re is the delay on the part of the debtor in real obligations. Recall that real obligations are the obligations to give. On the other hand, mora solvendi ex persona is the delay in personal obligations or delay on the part of the debtor in personal obligations. Recall that personal obligations are obligations to do and not to do. Pero ang tinutukoy na personal obligations dito ay obligations to do at hindi kasama ang obligations not to do. Why? Because there is no delay in an obligation not to do, as one cannot be in delay for not doing something. Of course, this is common sense. Paano madidelay si debtor kung ang kanyang obligation ay obligation not to do? Paano madidelay yung debtor kung hindi niya naman gagawin yung isang bagay? That's why there is no delay in an obligation not to do. Next, mora accipiendi. Mora accipiendi is the delay on the part of the creditor. As you can see, hindi lang si debtor ang nadidelay. Pwede ring madelay ang creditor. Mora accipiendi exists when the creditor refuses to accept the thing due without justifiable reason. In other words, mora accipiendi is the delay of the creditor to accept the delivery of the thing without justifiable reason. That means hindi inaccept ni creditor yung performance of the obligation ni debtor. Next, compensatio morae. This is the delay in reciprocal obligations. Ano bang ibig sabihin ng reciprocal obligation? Reciprocal obligation is an obligation in which each party is a debtor and a creditor of the other. Let me give you an example in order for you to understand reciprocal obligation. S sold his Toyota car to B for 200,000 pesos. Sa pag-deliver ng Toyota car, si S ang debtor at si B ang creditor. Pero sa pagbabayad ng 200,000 pesos, si B ang debtor at si S ang creditor. This is an example of a reciprocal obligation since each party is a debtor and a creditor of the other. That means si debtor, creditor din siya at si creditor, debtor din siya. Since compensatio mori is the delay in reciprocal obligations, both parties are in default. Meaning to say, si debtor at si creditor ay delay. Nag-incur ng delay si debtor and at the same time, nag-incur din ng delay si creditor. In compensatio mori, it is as if there is no delay. Why? Parang walang delay kasi nga si debtor in delay siya and at the same time si creditor in delay din siya. That's why it is as if there is no delay because both parties are in default or in delay. Next, when debtor incurs in delay in obligations to give or to do. Kung ang obligation ni debtor ay obligation to give or obligation to do, kailan ba siya nadidelay? The general rule is the debtor incurs in delay from the time the creditor demands fulfillment of the obligation either judicially or extrajudicially, but the debtor fails to comply with such demand. So ito na yung answer doon sa question kanina. Kapag hindi ba pinerform ni debtor ang kanyang obligation in due time, madedelay na ba siya? The answer is no. Why? Kasi nga, ang general rule, hanggat hindi pa nagdedemand si creditor ng fulfillment of the obligation from the debtor, hindi madedelay ang debtor. So para mas madaling matandaan yung general rule, no demand, no delay. Kung wala pang demand si creditor, hindi madedelay si debtor. Take note that the creditor may demand fulfillment of the obligation from the debtor either judicially or extrajudicially. Kapag sinabing judicially, that means meron ng intervention ang korte. So the creditor will file a case against the debtor. Kapag sinabi namang extrajudicially, walang intervention ang courts of justice. So that means hindi magdedemand ng fulfillment of the obligation si creditor sa korte. Before I provide example, let me first discuss the requisites of delay. Kapag sinabing requisites of delay, ito yung mga kailangan para masabi na nakapag-incur na ng delay si debtor. First, that the obligation be demandable and already liquidated. Ang ibig sabihin nito, pwede nang mag-demand si creditor ng performance of the obligation from the debtor. Second, the debtor does not perform the obligation. Of course, this is common sense. Paano makakapag-incur ng delay si debtor kung pinerform niya naman ang kanyang obligation in due time? That's why one of the requisites of delay is that the debtor does not perform the obligation. Third, the creditor demands the performance either judicially or extrajudicially. Na-discuss ko na to kanina. Fourth, the debtor fails to comply with such demand. Nung nagdemand na si creditor kay debtor ng performance of the obligation, hindi nag-comply si debtor. Hindi niya finulfill ang kanyang obligation. Let's have an example. DOC 5,000 pesos. The obligation is due on May 15. So, may utang si D kay C na 5,000 pesos. Dapat niyang bayaran yung 5,000 pesos on May 15. If D does not pay on May 15, he is not yet in delay. Why? Recall our general rule, no demand, no delay. So hanggat hindi pa nagdedemand si creditor ng fulfillment of the obligation from the debtor, hindi pa in delay si debtor. But if C makes a demand on him to pay on that date or within a reasonable time thereafter, and D does not comply, then D will be in delay. I-check na natin kung nandyan lahat yung requisites of delay. Una, demandable na ba yung obligation? Yes. The creditor may demand the performance of the obligation on May 15. Next, the debtor does not perform the obligation. Yes, hindi pinerform ni debtor ang kanyang obligation. Next, the creditor demands the performance either judicially or extrajudicially. Yes, C makes a demand on him to pay on that date or within a reasonable time thereafter. Next, the debtor fails to comply with such demand. Yes, kasi nung nag-demand si C ng performance of the obligation on May 15 or within a reasonable time thereafter, hindi nag-comply si debtor or hindi nag-comply si D. So all of the requisites of delay are there. Therefore, D, who is the debtor, will be in delay. So always remember the general rule, no demand, no delay. The general rule is that no demand, no delay. But take note, kung merong general rule, meron ding exceptions to the rule. At ano-ano yung mga exceptions to the rule? Delay will exist even without demand in the following cases. This is Article 1169 of the New Civil Code of the Philippines. First, delay will exist even without demand when the law so provides. Thus, where the law provides for the payment of penalty if the obligation is not performed on due date, such as in the case of taxes, then demand shall not be necessary. Ano ang ibig sabihin nito? Di ba? No demand, no delay. Pero kapag sinabi sa batas na meron pa ring delay kahit walang demand, then merong delay. Just like in the payment of taxes. There's a law that provides for the payment of taxes, and that is the National Internal Revenue Code. Yung mga taxpayers, dapat silang magbayad ng taxes before the due date or on the due date. Pero kapag lumagpas or nagbayad sila after the due date, then they will pay penalty. Hindi na kailangan ng demand ng government. That means kapag hindi sila nakabayad before the due date or on the due date, then may corresponding penalty. Next, delay will exist even without demand when the obligation expressly so declares. Hence, no demand is necessary, such as when a lease contract provides that the rental shall be paid by the lessee within the first 5 days of the month in advance without need of demand. As you can see in this example, there's a contract between the lessor and the lessee, and that contract is a lease contract. Nakalagay dun sa kanilang kontrata yung phrase na without need of demand. Klarong-klaro, maliwanag na nakalagay dun sa kanilang kontrata yung phrase na without need of demand. So that means kahit walang demand si lessor, kung hindi nakapagbayad si lessee within the first 5 days of the month, then the lessee will be in delay. Next, delay will exist even without demand when time is of the essence of the contract. Thus, where a rent-a-car company is obliged to provide for the bridal car during a wedding at a particular date, time, and place, the said company is liable if it fails to perform the said obligation, notwithstanding the absence of demand, since time was a controlling motive for the establishment of the contract. As you can see in this example, time is of the essence of the contract since kailangan yung bridal car during the wedding. The obligation of the rent-a-car company is to provide for the bridal car for the groom and the bride at a particular date, time, and place of the wedding. Kahit walang demand yung bride at groom, kung hindi provide ng rent-a-car company yung bridal car during the wedding, the rent-a-car company will be in delay since time is of the essence of the contract between the rent-a-car company and the bride and the groom. Next, delay will exist even without demand when demand would be useless. Thus, the debtor will be in delay even without demand from the creditor if the thing he is obliged to deliver has been destroyed through his fault or he has delivered it to another person. In this example, magiging useless yung demand ng creditor. Why? Kasi nga, yung dapat na i-deliver ni debtor kay creditor ay nasira na. Of course, fault yan ni debtor. Magiging useless din yung demand ni creditor kung yung dapat na i-deliver ni debtor kay creditor ay na-deliver ni debtor sa ibang tao. In both cases, the debtor will be in delay. Next, in reciprocal obligations, where the obligations arise out of the same cause and must be fulfilled at the same time, from the moment one of the parties fulfills his obligation, delay by the other begins notwithstanding the absence of demand. In reciprocal obligations, the parties must fulfill their obligations at the same time. Kung yung isa na-fulfill niya na yung kanyang obligation at yung isa hindi niya pa na-fulfill ang kanyang obligation, then yung isang party na hindi naka-fulfill ng kanyang obligation ay automatic na in delay kahit walang demand. Let's now proceed to the fourth ground for liability to pay damages, and that is contravention of the tenor of the obligation. When we say contravention of the tenor of the obligation, this means violation of a contract or breach of contract. Let's have examples. Example number 1, a contract of sale entered into by S as seller and B as buyer, where S is not the owner at the time of delivery. Ang kontrata ni S at B ay contract of sale. Of course, dapat yung binebenta ni S ay sa kanya. As you can see, there is a violation of a contract or breach of contract here since yung binebenta pala ni S ay hindi sa kanya. Next, a contract of carriage where the common carrier, bus, jeep, or taxi failed to take its passengers to their destination. Of course, ang intention ng passengers or ang purpose ng passengers, that's why sumakay sila sa bus, jeep, or taxi, ay para makarating dun sa kanilang destination. In this example, the common carrier failed to take its passengers to their destination. So that means there is a violation of a contract or breach of contract.